Okay, so it's the evening now of Friday, and we've been to lots of meetings throughout the day, lots of different things. So this morning, after the last video blog we did, I went along to a thing which was with people, a panel session with people from islands in the Pacific, different Pacific Oceans, specifically one woman, talking about the real problems there, because what we're noticing is that in the industrialised countries we're actually not really noticing the effects of climate change in the same way, because we don't live so sustainably, we don't live off the land in the same way, and we have kind of technologies that can hopefully, well, for the time being, adapt, maybe not in the future, but for now, you know, we're not noticing it. But over in the Pacific Islands, they really are, and there are some big changes happening, and actually it's a big problem. So she was, this woman was showing a lot of films about of people on these different islands in the South Pacific, giving real examples of what they're experiencing. And in some of the islands, the breadfruit tree, which is what gives most of their food, is basically dying because the water's getting too hot. And there's been major droughts, and all of their pools have too much salt in because they're not being replaced with rainwater. And out in the oceans, all the seas are coming much further in, and yeah, and there's also affecting other trees and plantation life that's growing there, and it's just becoming more difficult to live. One of the guys referred back to 1936 when there was a similar drought to what's happening now, and a lot of the people from the islands were taken away to live elsewhere because they couldn't live in the islands. However, now they're actually in a worse situation than they were in then, which is sort of worrying. It's got that much worse. But it was good to hear, you know, real kind of reports of from people about really what they're experiencing and real changes that global warming is happening. So there was that, which is interesting. And then afterwards, I went to something on biodiversity and climate change and kind of how they interact. I'll be honest that I think the problem is that some of the people in meetings are they're using a language that isn't accessible to a lot of people, which is limiting, and I think some people are doing it on purpose, some perhaps aren't. But I found that meeting particularly limiting for me because they were just using a lot of kind of technical jargon, a lot of stuff that I'm sure half the people in the room didn't really know what they were talking about. There's also the issue, of course, of good speakers versus bad speakers. But then afterwards, I went to a really interesting talk by the Met Office in the UK that actually really gave an impression of what's really going to happen in terms of in the next 100 years and what we're looking at in terms of temperature difference of 2 degrees versus 4 degrees. So I'll show this map. This is the impacts of global temperature rise of 4 degrees C. And there are kind of lots of changes happening. I mean, one of the major ones is, of course, we're also looking at huge population rise. And let's read this bit here about water availability. That the population rise in 2080, without climate change, just over 3 billion people. Just over 3 billion people of a population of 7.5 billion could be living in areas with limited water capacity, availability. And that's without climate change. With these issues of climate change, there's a lot more people living in areas where they don't have access to fresh water. And of course, you know, population growth doesn't help the situation, but neither is anything else that's happening. So that's, yeah, just one impression of lots of things. Basically what they were saying really well, they touched on two things. One was about temperature rise and the fact that, you know, this whole thing about 2%, because basically if you go over 2%, you end up, it's a kind of tipping point, you end up with a sort of runaway situation. But if we manage to stay under the 2%, then we have some level of perhaps being able to stop that from happening. The sea ice is going to, if we go over that amount, could diminish by 80%, 85%, and if it 280 and 85%. If it does that, it won't ever get back to 100% of what it is now, unless we must go through another ice age. So, really, the over 2% temperature rise is going to cause that to happen. And certainly 4% is going to cause it to go back to like 50% or 20% in the next 100 years.
which is quite a worrying amount and pushes up the water level to quite a considerable degree. By 2035, we're looking at about a metre, kind of 80 centimetres rise in water. So it was interesting to kind of see that and to see actually kind of real values of what their view on the facts is and what the situation might be. So it's good to see that there's some real kind of factual things happening. I think what's difficult and what we've kind of noticed here is there are a lot of people saying about these problems and saying about things that are going wrong and this whole kind of dystopia sort of thing. And actually in some people they were talking about there have been some animals that are adapting quite naturally to climate change, but looking at it most aren't. So the problem is we're noticing that people aren't really coming up with solutions. They're not really saying, well, we can do this and we can do that. Of course, that's not necessarily what's going to happen with the side events that we're attending, and hopefully that's what's happening in the main political UN summit. But it is really good to see, and it's really interesting. There's lots of people there, lots of different sorts of people. So yeah, so far it's been good, and hopefully we'll attend more of those and get back to what happened.